Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for putting on an amazing conference. This is a great breadth of different people and different approaches, doing really, really fantastic work. Now, John thought this would be an interesting talk just to take some parallels between what we did on vaccines to what could be done and is being done, I think, on dementia. So what I was going to just emphasize is some of the collaborative aspects of the work that we did in 2020 as far as vaccines was concerned. So obviously it was the ultimate translational achievement to go from sequence to vaccine in arms in 326 days, which was the Pfizer vaccine. And you know, these were pictures that you will have seen repeatedly, and rightly so, because this was just an astonishing achievement. And somebody this morning pulled out a New York Times article in April 2020 that said the earliest time that was most likely to get vaccines was in sort of 2025, and if we absolutely pulled all the stops out, we might start to get vaccines in the third or fourth quarter of 2021. So it clearly worked incredibly well, and this is my favourite picture. I don't know who else spent time looking at the world in data, but if you can see it, yeah, the bit you can't see is it's the map of the world, and this is where they were basically charting which countries had started vaccinating at different times, and the UK in early December was the only country in the world that was vaccinating. So that was good. So the reason I think we were successful is really because of the way we were set up and the team and the way we worked with those experts both in the UK and around the world. So I've spent 30 years in venture capital. Everything I look at is with a VC lens. And so this was another sort of venture capital type project as far as I was concerned. What we do in venture, and Ruth has talked a little bit earlier this afternoon, but we take breaking science and turn those insights into new drugs targeting disease-causing pathways so that we can actually alter the course of the disease progress. And so, of course, we set ourselves ambitious goals in venture, and clearly in vaccines, that's exactly what we did. Now, the goals we were set were pretty straightforward. Get vaccines for the UK, get vaccines for the world, and make sure we're better set up for next time. And what was important there is that we had those very clear goals, and we were able to make very quick decisions and make sure that everybody was aligned at the same time. The team, that was one of the conditions I set when I took on the job. First was to report to the PM, because I felt that actually, unless you had that ultimate authority, you'd just get bogged down in bureaucracy. And I think that was probably true, certainly based on what we've seen in all these WhatsApps. But what I did set was a requirement to be able to recruit my own team. And that, I think, was completely critical, because then we could bring in that expertise that we needed, both to assess the vaccines, look at the underlying science, look at the clinical, look at the development, manufacturing scale-up, regulatory, so that we could actually, on the back of incomplete data, of course, make the best decisions for the UK and more broadly. So bringing that team in was important, and the networks, and I'll talk a little bit about that, was completely critical. And that is the one thing that government really didn't have, and that's why they needed to create a vaccine task force, because of course if they'd had all those networks and those capabilities in-house, they wouldn't have needed it from us. And then the final thing, which was probably most important and unusual for government, was this whole concept of risk management. So, of course, in May 2020, when I was appointed, we had no idea if any vaccine would work anyway. And we all knew what the chances that any vaccine would work. It's not dissimilar from therapeutics. And we all knew how slow it would be. So the approach we took is just, again, as we do with venture capital. So you invest across a range of different opportunities, each of which has legitimate reasons to think that could be successful, but then you stage the funding of that against the progress and the success that those different projects or companies make. So in our cases, we were not writing 100% of the cheque up front, nor do we in venture. We basically say, well, this is the overall scope of the contract, but we'll give you, whatever the number is, 25%, until you hit this milestone, and then we'll give you some more. So in venture, that's what we do in order to manage the risk of loss. And exactly the same thing as what we did in government. So sort of milestone-based funding. So Patrick was the reason all this happened and worked, and he is the guy who should be put up in lights to get the credit for actually creating the vaccine task force in the beginning. Interestingly, only 2 countries really got behind the concept of invest early and take the risk of investing in scale up and development before you know which vaccines might work, and that was Boris Johnson and Donald Trump. So I don't know if there's a lesson there. So you guys will know the time it takes normally to get vaccines, but this was an article in Nature which is pretty good. MMR was the quickest vaccine ever developed in little under 4 years, but 50 years ago, when clinical and regulatory standards were a lot lower than they are now. So it is amazing how quickly it was done. This was the team we put together. You can see a nice group of people, part industry, part civil service, so that we used largely, actually, they had also been recruited from the private sector, but civil servants who led on commercial and program management, diplomacy. And then the bottom group here is just like venture, so it's our investment committee. So these were the ministers that actually took the investment decision. So I wasn't allowed to spend anything. So either Whitehall spent money on less expensive projects, or the ministers spent money on more expensive things. But actually it worked incredibly well. We never met, we only ever met on Zoom, and that worked just fine. So our approach was recognise that the UK is a very small pin drop in the context of the world. And the JCVI had told us that their recommendations were that only the vulnerable should be vaccinated, and that was the case all throughout 2020. So, and the vulnerable was basically what became groups 1 through 9. So all adults over the age of 50 and all adults under 50 with underlying disease. There were no clinical trials being run on children or adolescents at that point. So we were going to be a customer of 30 million people. And we realized that that was small in the context of the US, of European Union. And so our approach was basically to leverage the assets that we have in the UK. We didn't have time to build things from scratch, but we could use them cleverly and bring everybody to work together to achieve the same goals, which were so clear. And so this was the early manufacturing group that was pulled together before I even turned up on the scene. So these groups were assembled through the BIA, the Bioindustry Association, and they basically put their hands up to say, we can help collaboratively, because we've each got skills and expertise and capabilities in manufacturing and scale up that we think will be helpful to scaling up vaccines. And it is remarkable that this group that started in February 2020 was so effective. And by the time I arrived, there was a skeleton supply chain already in place. And if you remember all the political rhetoric of the European Union suing everybody and everybody supposedly stealing each other's vaccines, the reality was this group got going early. Our manufacturing was more effective than anywhere else. And so we then sent our teams to those other facilities in Europe to actually help them scale up and get their manufacturing working. So the collaboration here, and it's not just private sector, it's private sector and public sector, and as you can see, universities and academic centres too. It was astonishing, and it was highly effective. And so by the time I left, we were able to then focus those manufacturing and those capabilities such that we were able to have some level of manufacturing of some of the vaccines we bought in the UK. Now, it was not our plan that we should be wholly self-sufficient for every vaccine ever, but it was our plan that we should build up greater population scale capability in the UK, and that's what we've done. On the clinical development, we set up a registry so that once the MHRA had taken this whole approach of a rolling review, such that regulatory times and processes were massively compressed. The next slowest thing, as you all know, is to get people into clinical trials. So we set up a registry on the NHS website so that anybody sitting at home who wanted to figure out how they could contribute could sign up on the NHS to basically consent to being contacted about clinical trials. And of course, that's what we wanted for vaccines, so that we could go and approach the companies to say why they should be working with the UK, so that we could, we could enrol their trials quickly. But also, we had an eye to the future, which is if you start to get a good-sized registry, could you then start to expand that to go into different patient indications and different patient populations? So we asked a question. The process for signing up was quite short, but you had to answer a whole bunch of health questions, which were basically the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the trials themselves. Because what we didn't want was to have a database of fit young 25-year-olds. We needed to include people who are older and vulnerable to disease, because we had to show that those people actually responded to any of these vaccines. So that worked. 94% of the people who signed up said yes, they would be willing to be contacted about trials outside vaccines, and we ended up with 550,000 people there. So that is a potentially, if the government doesn't kill it, resource to then expand and start working with some of the patient charities so that we can get a much broader group of people into trials. So the question is, could we do the same thing in dementia? And my view is absolutely we can and should. And it's not, you guys don't need to be reminded how difficult it's been, but $42 billion spent on clinical stage Alzheimer's dementia, Alzheimer's disease research since 2015. That is a phenomenal amount of money to spend and to have such little to show for it. And as a result, the pharma industry has basically just, in large cases, abandoned the sector. So it's been a really difficult space for the industry to continue to invest in. And the other issue is there have been very few mechanistic approaches that have been tested systematically in the different forms of dementia. So if you think about cancer, 20 years ago we talked about having breast cancer or colon cancer. Now we talk about HER2 positive or triple negative, and we talk much more about the mechanism behind what's driving and causing the cancer. And in dementia, we just haven't been doing that in Alzheimer's. And more broadly. So there are so many different forms of mechanisms which are thought to contribute to different aspects of neurodegeneration, as well as a whole bunch of new formats. So, we've moved away from just having a little white pill to manage all our medicine, all our treatment approaches, and we've now got all kinds of cell therapy, biological therapy, gene therapy, CRISPRs, editing, all these sort of things. So there's been vast progress in terms of the sorts of scope of what is being done now in dementia. And of course, if I just take, on the left-hand side is sort of the UK ecosystem, and then on the right, some of the key players in the US. And we fundamentally need to figure out ways, collectively as a community, to actually reduce the costs of both research, but importantly the translation and developing clinical data to show that some of these new approaches work, and working out which are the patients and how do you stratify them and how do you get them into trials so that we can test some of these new mechanisms. And I've highlighted in particular this Life Science Missions. Not yet announced, and I hope it's going to happen, but this is the government's approach to trying to supposedly replicate some of the successes of the vaccine Taskforce. So John Bell and John Simons, the chair of GSK, were asked in 2021 to refresh the UK's life science strategy. And because they saw that the UK had done well in vaccines, so they're basically saying, okay, right, what else can we do? How can we leverage on this success? And so one of the recommendations was to create a series of missions where they would bring somebody in from the outside, give them some level of budget, and agree a set of objectives and say, right, what can you actually deliver in a time frame, and trying to harness that urgency and focus on outcomes and focus on delivery, but by using an established ecosystem. We couldn't have done anything close to what we did in vaccines had there not been an already vibrant, well-connected, supportive ecosystem, which is what we had. And that's what you've got here. And that's why I think dementia, in my mind, is the absolute, poster child for where is the next place that we should be going with this sort of collaborative, outcome-focused approach. Now, we all know, and I don't need, again, to tell you guys how difficult it is in terms of some of the translational challenges. I mean, there's almost everything that is impossible in this sector. But again, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try, and doesn't mean we shouldn't be developing new biomarkers, developing new data tools to actually identify the patients, to identify the different drivers of disease, and try and develop new models so that we can capture some of the potentially most promising approaches and do so without spending $42 billion on it. And full disclosure, I am completely conflicted here because we manage a fund called Dementia Discovery Fund. So we do what we otherwise call sort of everything else other than dementia in our biotech funds. And then we have now 2 dedicated funds where we've actually, unusually for venture actually, we put the name of the fund to actually say what it does on the tin. And it is there to basically discover new mechanisms that we can develop drugs against that provide disease-altering treatments for patients. So we're not interested in symptomatic. I mean, we may include symptomatic, but our drivers are to find disease-modifying drugs. And to do so, we will be looking at, and are looking, and you can see a whole bunch of company logos here, at a whole bunch of different mechanisms to actually explore both preclinically and then into the clinic. And you can see this is the sort of range of some of the mechanisms that we've been looking at. So our first fund, you can see sort of mitochondrial dynamics, membrane trafficking, so on, things like that. And then as we're progressing, we're looking at a broader range of different mechanistic approaches. And each of them come, of course, with their own challenges, their own need for biomarkers, patient selection, and monitoring. But you should think about all the things you're doing, and anything that you think is legit that has a prospect of having some translatability, would certainly be keen to have a look. I do put a health warning, which is it is incredibly hard to raise money in this space. So with my biotech hat on, if you could have a choice between investing in an oncology company or an immunology inflammation company versus dementia, every time the VC is going to go for onc and inflammation because it's just much easier. But we are absolutely making progress on dementia, and we've now got more funds that are coming in and more potential co-investing partners, which is great. Now, I think there's a broader opportunity again in dementia if we possibly can pull it together, because I mean it's becoming increasingly important, and rightly so, topic about how do we actually ensure that the trials we run actually represent the demographics population in which we live, and we don't in our clinical trials. And again, because we've got such strong and widespread networks here in the UK, we actually can start to do that, and so that we should be able to bring in a much more inclusive cohorts into trials, and therefore ultimately start treating people according to disease as opposed to postcode. Again, if we can start thinking about, as we've heard some of the talks earlier, if we can start identifying patients at high risk earlier and start intervening more quickly, we don't have a lot of interventions right now, but we will. That is going to have a massive effect on the cost of treating dementia. And we do have capability in the UK, both on manufacturing, but also on clinical trials. So these are things that I think the UK really can take a lead if we all swing together and aim for the same thing. But I don't want to hide from the fact I think we've got some really serious issues. So where to start? I mean, maybe Horizon is going to work. We'll have to see. But basically, the UK, we've got reduced clinical trials that are being run over here. We've got a really challenging position as far as the pharmaceutical industry is concerned, with actually getting access to and being able to launch and sell innovative medicines here. In my sort of narrow world, R&D tax credits are an important part of how we build and support our companies. So I do think there are some pretty big issues. I've been quite vocal about them, so I'm hoping that some might improve, but let's wait and see. So in terms of what I think the opportunities are, if I go back with my sort of venture capital hat, I think we need to set a few very punchy goals. And as a collective sector, we need to figure out, and these may not be the right goals, but we need to, and it may be that it's best done through the missions. I'm not sure what the right area will be. But we need to set some goals which have to include testing new mechanisms in patients so that we can get early efficacy and safety of these new mechanisms. We've got to be able to get show that we can enroll quickly into these trials so that drugs that are being developed or candidates being developed wherever they are around the world will think, well, why don't we go to the UK because they've got well-characterised, well-phenotyped, accessible clinical cohorts. And lots of the things you've been talking about today is things that we really need to bang the drum and make sure that people know what we can do. And I think we need to have a near-term goal. You know, I've said get 5 new drugs into late-stage treatment in 5 years, but we've got to have something so that we have some real potential wins that we can go for. Because at the moment, it is not acceptable to get a diagnosis and be told now that there's really nothing we can do and we can just tell you how quickly you're going to go down. That is not somewhere we should be happy to accept. We've absolutely got to find and develop these new drugs. Now, working partnership is the only way to do it. Industry can't do it on its own, academia can't do it on its own, but collectively, if we can agree some common goals and shared objectives, we can do it. And that's something, you know, we've demonstrated, despite all the odds that we did it well in vaccines, there is no reason why we can't do it in dementia. I completely accept it's harder, but there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to do it. And you've already got good registries, but how do we make them bigger, more accessible, more available to industry and participants so that they can, as soon as anyone gets a diagnosis, they get told, right, here are the trials that you could be eligible for. That my vision is that anybody with any diagnosis, whether it's dementia or otherwise, should be told, here are the clinical trials you're eligible for, if they have a disease that is not well treated. And then my last thing is, you know, we've just got to educate government. I've banged on about this long enough, but, you know, 90% of Whitehall have humanities degrees. Well, in a technological 21st century, that seems to be the wrong way around. And I do understand that we've now got a new science department, but it's not exactly led by a scientist. And with the musical chairs you see with both politicians and civil servants, it's a pretty gloomy place if nobody stays put long enough to be able to actually build up those skills. So I think there needs to be a concerted push to try and upskill our government in its broadest machine so that they actually understand the consequences of policy, they understand the opportunities of what we've got, so that we can actually position the UK as one of the leaders in a whole bunch of areas. But for me, I think dementia is one of them. So I'm going to stop there, and if there's any questions, happy to take them. Is that all right?
Questions from the floor? I see a hand towards the back. Susan.
Hi, Kate. Thank you so much. That was really inspiring. A lot of the challenges you outlined are very generic challenges to all disease areas. Are there one or two things that you think we could pick off as a dementia community to make a test case for progress, to show progress in other areas, but actually to try and tackle as a priority in dementia?
I mean, the things that are most visible will be some levels of early efficacy. So whether it's proof of mechanism in early patients. Obviously, you know, it'd be lovely to get some big phase 3 data. That's not realistic yet. But the things that will capture the imagination of the media and the government and partners from around the world will be showing that we can get patients recruited into innovative studies quickly. And if we can use novel biomarkers, new ways of evaluating progress, ways of stratifying patients to begin with, but showing that we can do it in these early phase 1b studies or small phase 2a studies, that to me is the biggest first step. And then you do it, you repeat it until then people start coming. I mean, that's a slightly generic answer, but I think that is going to be the most visible set of measures that are going to get people excited. And I know it's a long way to get there, but we just need to do it.
I saw another hand over there first, yeah.
Do you think you could form a global Alzheimer task force? So in the vaccine effort, you essentially have Clive Dix and team look at essentially in a fortnight come down to say a dozen candidates. So we've got the 141 unique Alzheimer candidates. Could you imagine assembling a team that in a fortnight could say, these are the 12 that we're going to fast track, and within 5 years see how accurate our predictions and acceleration was?
I mean, the trouble with we worked closely with other countries. So I spoke to the US every other week. So many of you, I'm sure, will know Moncef Slaoui, who knows a thing or two about vaccines, and he taught me an awful lot. And so we weren't obviously part of the same team, but we were very joined up from a communication perspective, as we were, despite the political rhetoric, with Europe. So actually, we were all closely aligned, but we were separate teams. So I think the simplest way is to make sure that we communicate very clearly. And if we deviate and have different approaches, then at least we talk about why are we doing this and you think that's a bad idea. And then it allows that conversation to happen as to why we may make different decisions. But trying to turn it into a single team, I think would be a bureaucratic nightmare. And you'd end up having a pissing match while everyone is arguing about who does what and who's responsible for what. So it'd be much better to have slightly more nimble teams. And this is where the Brexit lot all got very excited by the vaccine Taskforce. It wasn't that because of Brexit, because we were in Europe when the VTF was set up, but it was the fact that we were a single country compared with 27, and a single country just can make decisions more quickly than if you have to get 27 to make decisions. So I wouldn't do any global task force, but I would make sure that everybody talks completely openly and clearly, because we're not competing against each other. We're all competing against this miserable disease or set of diseases that we need to stop. And to the extent we can all share information and data like we did with vaccines. So of course our clinical data and our manufacturing capabilities, we shared. There was no reason to not share that capability. We needed to stop people getting infected and becoming seriously sick. Same is true here. So I wouldn't centralize. There's one down here.
One more.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. You didn't quite get to the very last point on your slide there about removing legislative blocks to innovation. So I was wondering what you actually think those roadblocks are and how to go about removing them.
Where to start? Okay, so there's Horizon, which I think is clearly important because we have to, again, that's all about collaboration, and it is obviously underlying academic, but that is going to be a big driver of innovation. So something like 70% of all new pharmaceutical medicines now are discovered in small companies, and that will again be the large majority will come out of innovative academia. So that is a key point. The second is going to be about things like R&D tax credits, clearly not helpful. just being able to get clinical trials run. That is a roadblock to innovation because at the moment we have the pharma industry and biotech abandoning the UK because they can't recruit quickly enough. And in a world where actually you've got plenty of patients all around the world, and you've got a choice of you could go to Spain, which is now the second fastest recruiting country, or you come to the UK and you spend nearly a year to open up your sites. That is not acceptable. And so that's what I mean about some of the roadblocks. I also mean, you know, if we're going to have a industrial strategy that doubles down on life sciences generally as one of the key areas that the UK is good at, well then don't alienate the people in the sector. And so, you know, that means working nicely in the sandpit with the pharmaceutical industry and the biotech industry and not trying to chop them off at the knees on pricing. Because some of this is I can understand that the government thinks it's broke, but the EU has 50% more innovative medicines available to EU citizens than we do in the UK. And yet there is absolutely no reason why we can't be supporting the clinical development of those drugs, why we can't contribute the very substantial skills and capabilities that we've got here to making sure we get the right patients with the right drugs treated properly. But that's not happening at the moment, and that needs to change.
Very good. With that, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, folks.
Thank you.
Okay.